Welcome to Structural Accountability. I'm Juan Ojeda Jr., an independent researcher and tax professional focused on governance, reporting systems, operational risk, and accountability in complex organizations. This audio brief accompanies the inaugural issue of the Structural Accountability newsletter on LinkedIn, titled The Hidden Cost of Structural Friction in Tax and Compliance Operations. One of the reasons I wanted to write this article is because throughout my career, I've repeatedly encountered situations where organizations focus on the visible problem while overlooking the structure producing it. In tax and compliance work, the visible problem is often easy to identify: a notice backlog, a delayed response, a missed deadline, a reporting issue, an escalation that could have been avoided. What is often less visible is the set of conditions that allowed the problem to emerge in the first place. Over time, I began noticing that many operational challenges weren't isolated events. They were symptoms of something deeper. They reflected how information moved through an organization, how responsibility was assigned, how workflows were designed, and how teams responded to increasing complexity. The specific facts were different from one environment to another, but the underlying patterns often looked remarkably similar. That's what led me to begin thinking about structural friction. When I use that term, I'm referring to small inefficiencies organizations gradually normalize over time, not major failures, not scandals, not catastrophic breakdowns, small things, documentation that isn't consistently maintained, processes that require unnecessary rework, approval chains that create delays, responsibilities that are assumed but never formally defined, systems that depend too heavily on a few individuals. Each of these may seem manageable on its own, but organizations rarely experience them in isolation. They accumulate. And when they accumulate, they begin affecting performance in ways that aren't always immediately visible. One example that comes to mind involves notice management and compliance workflows. In some environments, responsibility is clearly assigned. Documentation is centralized. Processes are repeatable. When volume increases, the system absorbs the pressure reasonably well. In other environments, notice handling becomes highly dependent on individual memory, email chains, and informal communication. The organization may function adequately under normal circumstances, but once complexity increases, the friction becomes visible. Things begin falling between the cracks. Response times increase. Tracking becomes inconsistent. Teams spend more time locating information than acting on it. What's interesting is that the notices themselves are not the core issue. The notices simply reveal the condition of the underlying system. And I think that observation extends well beyond tax and compliance operations. The reason structural friction matters is not because inefficiency is frustrating. It matters because inefficiency influences outcomes. It affects reporting quality, decision making, accountability, oversight, and ultimately organizational credibility. One area I continue researching is the relationship between operational pressure and reporting behavior. Many discussions about reporting quality focus on standards, controls, or compliance requirements. Those factors are important, but organizations don't operate in a vacuum. They operate under constraints, staffing constraints, resource constraints, time constraints, financial constraints. When pressure increases, systems are tested. And during those periods, organizations often discover whether their processes are truly scalable or simply functioning because conditions have been favorable. Documentation quality can decline. Review processes become compressed. Exceptions become normalized. Communication becomes reactive rather than deliberate. At that point, the issue is no longer simply operational, it's connected to governance. One of the themes you'll hear repeatedly throughout structural accountability is that governance is not separate from operations. Governance becomes visible through operations, through workflows, through review structures, through accountability systems, through how organizations move information and make decisions. That's why I think structural friction deserves attention, not because it's an efficiency problem, but because it's often an early indicator of deeper organizational conditions. Before I close, I'd like to introduce what I hope becomes a recurring part of these audio briefs, a short reflection beyond the article itself. One idea I didn't fully explore in the newsletter is something I think about often: the normalization of dysfunction. Organizations are highly adaptable. People develop workarounds. Teams find a way to compensate for process weaknesses. Managers absorb bottlenecks. Employees create informal systems to keep things moving. In many cases, that's what allows organizations to continue functioning. But adaptation can also conceal problems. When inefficiencies become familiar, they stop attracting attention. What was once viewed as temporary becomes routine. What was once viewed as a workaround becomes the process. And because the costs are distributed across many people, the organization may never fully recognize the cumulative impact. That's a question I continue exploring in my own research. At what point does adaptation become a barrier to recognizing structural risk? And how often do organizations mistake their ability to absorb friction for evidence that the system is functioning effectively? I think those questions have important implications for governance, reporting credibility, and accountability going forward. Thank you for listening to the first Structural Accountability audio brief. If you're interested in governance, reporting systems, operational risk, accountability, and organizational complexity, I invite you to subscribe to the Structural Accountability newsletter on LinkedIn. I'm Juan Ojeda Jr. Thank you for listening.